Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time we completed the Ice Palace, and well, the less said about there the better. Following the game's intended dungeon order, our next stop is Mire, which is not the Swamp Palace. Different dungeon, we already did that one. As far as pre-dungeon stuff to do goes, this is pretty minimal. You have to at least have found both the Ether Medallion, which you can obtain anytime after extracting the Master Sword, and the Ocarina of Wind. The flute, which you can get by first obtaining the shovel from this kid and then digging around his hangout spot in the light world before he dies in front of you. His dad will let you keep it, and it acts as this game's fast travel system. Ideally, you would have gotten this much earlier on in the game, but this is the first dungeon in which it is absolutely needed to gain access. The reason is that the Swamp of Evil, which occupies the same corner of the map as the desert does in the light world, is completely surrounded by high walls on all sides, and therefore inaccessible from within the dark world. Instead, just like how we found entry to the Ice Palace, we need to find a way in from the world of light instead. Long story short, the portal's on this ledge, accessible only as a fast travel spot. So get that wind ocarina, the flute. Get that flute. Once we're here in the Swamp of Evil, it's pretty obvious from this crest on the ground that we need to use Ether here. But if you're having trouble figuring that out, there is this dude in a nearby cave who will give you a hint about it for 20 rupees. Regardless, the Ether Medallion will clear up the storm and reveal the dungeon entrance, which dramatically raises out from the ground. Epic. Love how the entrance looks like this creepy face. It's such a chilling design, and this moment is one of those little things that just stuck with me as a kid playing this game. Anyways, with all of that said and done, we can now head into the dungeon. Welcome to Mire, and oh boy, this is a complex dungeon. Last time I confessed that I really never liked the Ice Palace. It was a dungeon that frustrated me to no end as a kid, and I had hoped that replaying it with a more critical eye, as well as a better refined and trained sense of level design, would change my views of the dungeon. In the case of the Ice Palace, it did not. I still do not like that dungeon. However, a similar opportunity arose here. Mire straight up confused me as a kid, and this dungeon is so packed full of dangerous enemies and traps that in addition to just being lost, I was basically fighting for my life the entire time I was in here as a kid. My child self found this dungeon, like the Ice Palace, to be a frustrating endeavor. So again, I hoped that this revisit would potentially alter my view of this dungeon, and unlike the Ice Palace, I'm happy to say that it has. Granted, this dungeon is pretty complicated. I mean, just look at this map. But that is not a bad thing. We're into the late game now, so the dungeons should be pushing us to think harder and fight better. It's called a difficulty curve, and we're now pretty far into it at this point. Now, it isn't a perfect dungeon by any means. I think the boss in particular is another big letdown, and we'll come back to that. But for the most part, this dungeon checks a lot of boxes for me. We've got a large, important central room that the dungeon branches out from, a great variety in room designs and layouts to keep navigation memorable, and a real sense of interconnectivity between rooms, as halls and walkways overlap and crisscross. Treasure chest teases, interesting combat scenarios, well-placed red-blue gem switch barriers, a dungeon item that is actually used for progression. It has got it all. This isn't one of those dungeons with a lot of individual puzzles spread through different rooms. No, this is one of those dungeons where navigation is the primary puzzle itself, and I love that. This isn't to say that there are no individual room puzzles, there's just less of an emphasis on those compared to the bigger picture. We have a ton of explorable space almost right away, and loads of dead ends. There is an abundance of locked doors with keys strategically spread out throughout the dungeon, meaning while certain areas are gated from the start, we'll need to explore thoroughly and track those keys down. Alright, but let's rewind for a second and start from the top. The dungeon entry here leads us through a few rooms, setting the stage for the more intense combat focus that is found within this dungeon. I think it is worth mentioning as well quickly that while the game intends for you to use the hookshot here to cross this gap, you can totally cheese it with the Pegasus boots if you're doing these dungeons out of order. Before too long, we're led into that aforementioned central room. From here, things can start to feel overwhelming at a glance. We've got this large room with 7 doors ahead of us, so one might ask where to even start. But the game actually does help narrow things down via process of elimination. 2 of these doors are locked. This one is behind the blue barriers, and these blocks impede you from going left anyways. So it isn't difficult to intuit to go right first through this nearest door. It is certainly the implication based on the layout. That said, this does not actually aid progression. It's just the game nudging you here so that it can tease you with the big chest and with this treasure chest which contains the map. Neither can be obtained right now just yet, so you're pushed back to the central room and you're going to be making a mental note of that area being important. What we're really going to need is the big key, which is found in the southwest corner of the dungeon, but we don't know that yet, so we're let loose to explore instead. All of this highlighted space is open to us right away, so we can explore, potentially collect up to 4 different small keys, and catch a glimpse of important locations and doors. With enough exploration, we should eventually make it over to this staircase, since almost every other path ends with a dead end, at least without that big key. This is the path to get said big keys, so it is important, but again, we have to explore before actually getting there, because 2 of those 4 small keys are needed here. This is where my only real complaint about the dungeon's progression comes into play. This puzzle isn't particularly intuitive in my opinion. We get a hint here to light these 4 torches to open the way forward. Okay, fair enough. And when we light the torches, we get that animation that something has changed. The same tremor effect used in previous dungeons when a wall is moved aside. The way forward is to drop down this hole and down to the floor below, where we'll find the big key. This is similar in concept to how we got the moon pearl back in the Tower of Hera. However, the key difference here is how this drop is conveyed to us visually. In every other dungeon, when you can drop off a ledge to a room downstairs, we get visual confirmation of a floor below. In other instances, when there are drops into the void that would cause you damage, it just looks like, well, a black bottomless pit. There's a visual distinction between where and when you can hop down to a floor below, or when you should not. This pit is the one exception. You're supposed to drop down here, but it looks like a bottomless void. I do not see this and think that it's where I should be going. The game has trained me to subconsciously read this as danger. A small visual tweak would fix this. Honestly, it wouldn't have been hard. I know this pit only appears after completing the torch lighting puzzle, so it could be argued that the change in the room is enough to drive you down here, but on the flip side, this is a Zelda dungeon that is pretty far into the game. It is not unreasonable to think that there are players who would not see this room in its before state at all, because they saw unlit received torches in the previous room and figured out that they were supposed to light them before they even went into this room and read the hint about it. In fact, that is exactly what I did. I'm a simple man. I see torches, I light them. It's not a deal breaker for me, but it is something that does stand out. Maybe locking one of these torches behind a key and putting that key in this room would fix that, but I'm not sure. There are so many other keys in this dungeon that it could end up not working anyways. Moving on, once we've got that big key, there's a lot more we can do now. Naturally, we're going to want to run back to the eastern side of the dungeon and get the item next. After all, new items are usually some of the most exciting parts of a dungeon. However, if we're following an intuitive path, I think player curiosity is more likely to lead people away from that. This teleport pad in the room adjacent to where we got the big key will warp us over to this room, which has the big key door. Since we just got the big key, most people will probably head down this way next. Initially, I was going to put this down more as a nitpick, but I think this was very much on purpose. We'll be led downstairs where we'll immediately be halted by a puzzle that we can't solve without the dungeon item. After being stuck at this dead end, it isn't unreasonable to either backtrack, explore elsewhere, or think to yourself, I'm missing something. Either way, it actually is a pretty short route back to where both the map, if you haven't gotten it yet, and the big chest are found. So we can finally nab that item. This is the Cane of Samaria, and it is an awesome dungeon item. It allows you to temporarily make blocks that can be pushed around for puzzle solving. And if you're doing dungeons out of order, it is the secret sauce to cheesing that one puzzle that I hate so much in the Ice Palace. Here, it is the key to that puzzle that we couldn't solve downstairs, giving us the player that wonderful aha moment. From here, A Link to the Past somewhat falls back on the same structure that many of its earlier dungeons have used. We've gotten this large open explorable space, and now we have a linear, challenge-filled section leading up towards the boss fight. This is still pretty fun. It's not super combat heavy, but there's a few more puzzles using those red-blue gem switches and barriers, which I'm always fond of. That said, it would have been cool to find a little more use for the Cane of Samaria in this section, but I'm just nitpicking at this point, I guess. With all of that said, once we've made our way through here, we can confront the dungeon boss. Of all the bosses in A Link to the Past, Vitreous is definitely one of them. Hey, who left my cold stare out to thaw? Okay, jokes aside, Vitreous, besides having an admittedly pretty cool name, is even more guilty of the same crimes as the last boss. He is, to put it simply, completely uninteresting. He's just a pile of giant eyeballs and a puddle of chew jelly. He has two basic attacks: launching eyeballs at you, which you can easily beat back with your sword, and this lightning strike attack, similar to an attack that Aghanim does. Of course, he only aims straight forward, so these attacks will always occupy the middle third of the room, meaning you can literally just stand off to one side and spam sword swipes. After a while, he'll come out of his little puddle for a second phase, in which he'll charge at you directly, but he's slow and moves in a very predictable way, so you can just continue to stand in said position off to the side and continue mashing the B button to slash away and win this fight. No dungeon item required, no skill required either. Overall, I like the boss battles in this game. There's a great variety, but at this point with Vitreous and Cold Stare back to back like this, it really feels like they were running out of ideas, especially when Argus back in the Swamp Palace already did this whole giant eyeball with smaller things protecting it concept better. And that fight managed to make use of the dungeon item. This battle does not find any use for the Cane of Samaria at all. Imagine if they had used the Cane's abilities to, say, create moving platforms on a track, which gets put to use in the next dungeon, and built a boss arena around this concept with gaps you'd need to cross in order to avoid his attacks, or even to deal damage yourself. That could have been a great use of the item and a far more dynamic fight. Instead, we got this. I timed it. I literally stood in this corner mashing B for literally less than a minute, and that was the entire fight. Ugh, we can do better than this. We have done better than this. But unfortunately for Vitreous, this boss is simply uninteresting. Kudos to whoever at Nintendo thought of the name Vitreous though, that's pretty cool. Once he's defeated, not that he ever stood a chance, we'll get our heart container as usual, the maiden is freed, also as usual, and we're headed towards Turtle Rock next. So, that's the dungeon. Despite having a total letdown of a boss battle, there is a lot to appreciate here about Mire. While the dungeon has a winding, twisting feel, I do appreciate how surprisingly well it conveys its objectives to you. It lets you wander around almost aimlessly for a bit so that you can see where all the points of interest are. It lets you see the big treasure chest where the dungeon item is, the doors you need the big key for, and even a handful of other treasure chests. It gives you all the pieces to the puzzle and then lets you run loose and put things together yourself. I think that is really what makes this dungeon great. It certainly isn't a perfect dungeon. There's that one puzzle that could be improved with some minor visual tweaks, and the compass is placed in a bit of a weird spot for me, but that's all pretty forgivable. The compass only shows us where the boss location is, and the paths towards the bosses in this game are often intuitive enough for me to say that the compass is hardly ever needed, if at all. Plus, if you're making a conscious effort to be thorough in this dungeon, it isn't actually difficult to get. It's just a minor detour. It just also doesn't feel like it was placed with much significance in mind. I was initially going to complain about this locked door as well, but after a bit of thinking, I'm retracting that complaint. I noticed that I finished this dungeon with an extra key in my pocket because I never unlocked this door, because I never had to, but I quickly realized that this is indicative of the fact that there are multiple methods of obtaining the dungeon map. I like that. The dungeon letting you do things in more than one way is a good thing. If you've got these blue barriers up, then you can choose to spend that key here and get the map that way. Or if the barrier is down, you can head in from either the big chest room or this northern room and save that key. So depending on which barriers are up or down, the map is still obtainable either way. You just have to think around those barriers. I like that. So I didn't spend the key this time, but if they had left this key out, then it could make getting that map a serious pain for some players, as they'd have to travel to either of these two locations on nearly the other side of the dungeon to activate the switch and bring down those barriers. Rather than sending you way off the path, they built in a contingency. That's just smart design that I didn't even catch at first. So there you have it. While this is not my favorite dungeon in A Link to the Past, I think it gets pretty close up there. There's a few minor complaints, but overall, Mire gives you a large, sprawling, exploration-focused dungeon experience, and pairs it with a pretty nifty dungeon item. The biggest thing holding this dungeon back from greatness is a very lackluster boss battle. But even then, I like this dungeon a lot. Thank you all so much for watching, and an extra big thanks goes to my supporters across both Patreon and here on YouTube as a channel member. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Hylian Wes, Justin, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny, as well as so many more people, the names of which you're seeing on screen here. Thank you all so much for all of the support. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.